I'm here with Michael Doherty. Hello, Michael. How are you?
I'm well, Al.
It's good to see you. We're going to be talking for just a few minutes about Archibald MacLeish, possibly his most famous poem. It's called Ars Poetica. I asked Michael to read it, and then we'll talk about it for just a few minutes. Michael?
Okay, Ars Poetica. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases, twig by twig, the night entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be.
Thank you, Michael. Can I ask you a specific question about one of the lines? And then, of course, we'll talk more generally about what MacLeish is thinking about in relation to what a poem can be. A poem should be motionless in time. And then he says as, and I think by as he means as in, or in the way that the moon climbs. Can you pause?
There is a contradiction.
Yeah.
Because he's talking about motionless in time, and then the analogy he uses is as the moon climbs. There's motion in the moon climbing.
So what is it about the moon rising that is motionless like? It's not technically motionless, but it feels it, no?
Absolutely, because you only see it for a moment and do not detect the motion.
Okay, so what is it about a poem, according to MacLeish, that is like that?
Well, Al, you're asking a very deep question here.
I know, but that's what we do.
But again, okay, so here's Archibald MacLeish with, he's a forgotten poet, essentially.
Yeah.
But here's his poem, a beautiful lyrical poem that remains motionless in time.
Ah.
I would absolutely suggest that this poem of MacLeish's work will remain motionless in time, and us temporal beings who move through time will discuss it and interpret it differently.
Oh my goodness. You're saying something devastating and brilliant, which is that the poem, because it's a meta poem, it's a poem about poetry, it's a poem about itself, had a way of predicting its own future motionless and stability.
I think
so. How the hell does it do that?
Because I think MacLeish was a genius, an unrecognized genius who was put down by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and in his retreat to Paris, wrote one of the most beautiful lyrical poems in the English canon that is all but forgotten.
All right, let me ask you about the first two lines of the final stanza, just to get really close to this. And then, of course, we're going to have to talk about the difference between meaning and being.
Yeah.
You just have to, because that's what everybody does. Okay. A poem should be equal to, new line, not true. What's going on there?
Okay. These are pop quizzes by a professor, which I'm trying to be equal to, but not true. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Okay. Because truth is not the purpose of poetry. It is to delight and instruct, according to Horace in BC 19, who wrote the original Ars Poetica, which MacLeish is addressing here. So he is, again, he's making a meta statement that the poem should be equal to experience, but not necessarily true, because truth is elusive. That's my interpretation.
I love that. Can I take a turn at a variation on what you just said and see if that...
Please do so.
Okay. So a poem should not be equal to. A poem shouldn't imply that it is the world. A poem is a representation of the world. A poem is words about the world, right? So this is quite a sophisticated thing to be saying about a poem that is in fact saying something quite brilliant about the way the moon rises, about the way we see the moon in the trees, the twigs of the trees. And yet then he turns to say that a poem is not the world, not true, it is a poem. That's sort of admitting that beauty is not necessarily only natural. Beauty can be made through art.
Yeah.
How does that sound to you?
I'm in complete concurrence. I mean, it's a different way of stating the same thing, that it is a representation of truth, but not necessarily truth. Okay,
so before we get to meaning and being, which is the way we're going to end up, I have one more.
You're sounding like Heidegger now.
That's right. Yeah. It's a little Heideggerian stuff going on here, but let me try this. So the most obvious paradox in the poem is this thing about a poem needing to be wordless. Poems are obviously not wordless, not this one anyway. And then the simile is that it's not just wordless, but wordless in the way that a flight of birds is wordless. So can you explain that to us? I mean, we know the paradox, but let's go further than that. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds.
Okay, so again, pop quiz from the professor. I'll do my best.
You're doing great.
Flight of birds is a magnificent sight that stirs one's soul and does not need words. It is ineffable in the experience of it. You see a flight of birds take off, and you could hardly describe the feeling that gives you. You read a poem that is obscure as a poem should be palpable and mute as globed fruit. What the hell does that mean? But it sounds beautiful. So you listen to, you read it and experience it, and there's the wordlessness.
So I'm just going to say something, throw this out. You don't have to respond to it, and then we'll turn to the end of the poem.
Well, thank you.
It strikes me, it strikes me that this is a poem about poetry that is about the kinds of poems we could write, but is not counting itself necessarily as one of those poems. It is a poem about a poem that is as wordless as a flight of birds, but it itself is not wordless. This poem is a meta-poem that excludes itself from the demands of poetry that MacLeish is making on poems. And then, of course, once you think that, then you realize that this poem does so many of the things that the ideal poem is supposed to be doing. It's very complicated. All right, let's go to the famous distinction.
But the big twist, that was a perfect setup for the big twist.
I know, and that's how we're going to end. So these two lines, long before I knew MacLeish, long before I knew anything about Archibald MacLeish, who was very, very well known in his time, despite being knocked around by the, Eliot and Pound. Long before that, I was taught by my teachers, who were all new critics, that a poem should not mean but be. That my job as a college student was not to translate or paraphrase a poem. but to let it be, or to try to get close to it to understand its being. Then you go back to this poem, which is the origin of that distinction, and you realize that's not quite what he's saying. So help us out, Michael, help us out with that last distinction.
That last poem is perhaps, that last line is perhaps one of the most ironic lines in poetry.
Okay.
Because first of all, he is trying to define poetry. He is taking on Horace, who defined poetry and put a flag in the sand in literary criticism.
Yes.
He's doing an interpretation of that,
yes.
creating certain meaning that is inherent and laced into this poem, and then in the end, telling a poem should not mean but be, when he is trying to create so much meaning here, and then went on to a career of becoming a propagandist with his poetry.
So he became Mr. Meaning.
He became Mr. Meaning. He became the poster boy for FDR. He went completely against his own advice. So there's an incredible irony here. He went from being criticized as being derivative of Pound and Eliot to a poet who tried to define the meaning of being an American citizen and what citizenship meant.
Wow. And you know what's sad about the form we're using here for our video, our presentation, the ModPoMinute, is that we don't have an hour and a half to explain, to flesh out what you just said in a kind of literary, historical, and biographical way, except to point viewers of this video to the really interesting story of MacLeish, who decided that his phrase was social poetry, but basically political poetry, political writing, who decided that poems should mean, that plays should mean, that speeches should be written that mean, so that we could all be active anti-fascists, so that we could encourage the United States to get involved in World War II. That's what you're talking about. And
I'm talking specifically about his essay, The Irresponsibles, where he slashed Pound and Eliot and got back at them.
That's right. Even though when he wrote this poem, he was in the largest scheme of things, kind of taking the side of what might have been.
This was written in his journal of February 1925.
Nice
and published in Poetry Magazine, June of 1926, and subsequently in Pot of Earth, his second publication.
So it's thank you for that. So it is really a poem written in the 20s that doesn't fare, from his own point of view, fare well by the late 30s, when the urgencies of the late 30s made some poets, many poets, turn away from the autotelic poems should be not mean view, the view of high modernism. So you have in MacLeish the perfect example of a poet who moves from the high roaring 20s of modernism into the anti-fascist social meaning of the 30s and 40s. That's why, and then of course he had a whole thing going on in the 50s as well. Michael, we're gonna have to stop here, but thank you so much for causing this YouTube series to include Archibald MacLeish.
Well, thank you for allowing me to do so. As you know, I'm impassioned about MacLeish and midway through a biography.
Do you want to plug, but it's got to be quick, this plug. Do you want to plug the MacLeish organization that you're part of, just quickly?
Well, I've been recently elected the vice president of the Friends of Archibald MacLeish Library and Collection at Greenfield Community College, where Archie very kindly donated his personal library and 14,500 artifacts, including 43 honorary PhDs, 3 Pulitzers, National Book Awards, etc. They're housed there. And then I have the Archibald MacLeish Literary Society. So that group is actively looking for members, and we are actively getting involved in promoting literature and MacLeish.
Fantastic. We don't usually end with plugs, but I'm glad to do it in this case.
We've been an organization for 40 years.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Al.
Yep.
If you liked this episode, watch another and subscribe.
And join us for ModPo, a free and open course at modpo.org.